Introducing Mrs. Wolfensohn. For over 40 years, Elaine Wolfensohn has been involved in the field of education and arts education while raising her family. Her work in Australia and the United States has included teaching in private schools, creating teen tutoring programs in inner city schools, and training adult volunteers to tutor high school students. Mrs. Wolfensohn was educated here at Wellesley College, where she received her BA. She went on to receive her MA in French Literature from Columbia and her MED in Counseling Psychology from Teachers College. Mrs. Wolfensohn's commitment to education also extends into her community advisory work. For years, she chaired the program committee of the National Board of Young Audiences. She is President Emeritus of the Board of Directors of the American Friends of the Israel Philharmonic. In addition, she serves on the boards of Math for America, the Open University Foundation, and the Davidson School at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She is on the Oversight Board of Park City Math Institute and the Advisory Council of BRAC, BRAC, as well as the Presidential Advisory Committee of Teachers College. During her husband's presidency of the World Bank, Mrs. Wolfensohn worked closely with the bank on issues of early child development, education, and gender. With the Wolfensohn Development Center at Brookings, she was engaged in work on early childhood development and Middle East youth inclusion. I also have the privilege of introducing Barbara Bruns, who is the lead economist in the Latin America and the Caribbean region of the World Bank, responsible for education. She's currently leading a multi-year research study of teacher quality in Latin America and co-managing several impact evaluations of teacher pay for performance reform in Brazil. She's co-author of the book Making Schools Work, New Evidence on Accountability Reforms.
Shameless marketing.
With Dion Filmer and Harry Patrinos. As the first manager of the 14 million Spanish Impact Evaluation Fund at the World Bank from 2007 to 2009, Barbara oversaw the launch of more than 50 rigorous impact evaluations of health, education, and social protection programs. She also co-authored the World Bank IMF MDG Global Monitoring Reports of 2005, 2006, and 2007, served on the UN Secretary General's Education Task Force in 2003, and co-authored the book A Chance for Every Child, Achieving Universal Primary Education by 2015. From 2002 to 2004, she headed the Secretariat of the Global Education for All Fast Track Initiative. She holds degrees from the London School of Economics and the University of Chicago. And I have the privilege of also introducing Mary Yang, who is a senior advisor, Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. Welcome.
Let me add to that Mary Emming Young, she's a medical doctor who really created the early child development programs at the World Bank and in much of the developing world. She's spent 20 years really in the developing world or more. More, what? 28 years. Introducing a subject into the developing world that really doesn't get enough attention in the developed world and making a huge difference, which she will talk more about in a minute. So let me begin by thanking all of you for the presentations I've heard so far, which have been wonderful. And I'm sorry that Barbara and Mary didn't have the opportunity to hear how much good work you've done and how much you've all learned on what some of the main issues are in global development. When my husband was made president of the World Bank, he actually came to me for the first time ever and said, I can only take this job if you'll agree to travel with me. And I said, well, I can't travel with you if I don't have something to do. And he said, well, you can do education. You'll like that. So for 10 years, I really did do education. It's most of what I did. I was offered a position. I didn't take a position. I traveled throughout the world with my husband and basically observed schools, met with teachers, met with ministries, met with students and parents, and tried to find out where something good was happening. And if the first 2 years that we were at the bank were just visiting each region of the world, by the end of those 2 years, I was feeling pretty depressed, because what did I see? I saw poor teaching, no learning. I mean, the first country we visited was Mali. 4 out of 5 students who began first grade dropped out before the end of 5th grade. My comment was, well, they're intelligent, because if you look in the classrooms, they're not learning anything. It was a time, the 90s and until now really, have been a time of real focus on education for all, getting children into school, very much the presentation we just heard, school access, closing the gender gap. Larry Summers in 1992 said, and had a huge influence, educating girls yields a higher rate of return than any other investment in the developing world. People really began to listen. And that's important for you as students and as future field workers to know that that research, so the research he did in economics, and he was surprised at that time, I believe. I think you were at the bank. To all of it, it's not what he expected. But when you have that proof that investing in girls' education really makes a difference, countries listen. That's going to change your GDP. You know, that's going to help. And these are the issues I want you to think about as you listen to Barbara and Mary. I worked very closely with both Barbara and Mary. Mary, I have to say, introduced me to early child development. If I came to the bank thinking I would only focus on education, within 6 months, Mary had taken me to an early child development conference in Georgia with President Carter. And by the end of that conference, I was said, it's going to be early child development in education. And gender equity is just something you need for the world to work. So those were my issues. They're still my issues, basically. What this session is going to do is talk to you about what's happened during these last years, this access, education for all, where we're coming from, and how did we get to this new strategy of learning for all? And what difference is that going to make? And why wasn't, I mean, to me, having been present at the bank for 3 different strategies, I was disappointed with all 3. When I looked at the new strategy and saw learning for all quality, I almost jumped up and down with excitement. It was so refreshing. It was really about teaching and learning and investing wisely and using research and talking about the essence of learning and not just schools. So with that, I'm going to begin by asking Mary, I think it would be helpful if you could begin by telling us how you achieved what you achieved over these last years. How did you introduce, what programs existed, and how did you know what type of programs to begin doing when you started working in the developing world?
Thank you, Elaine. In 1990, when the Education for All was declared, and goal 1 was learning starts at birth. However, among the international agencies, all the concern was still focused on primary education, and the bank, with all this investment in the social sector, investing in people, but also focusing on health and also primary education. So I think it's really with Mr. Wolfensohn's starting at the bank, and shortly 1996, we had the first international conference investing in young people. In young children that had talked about, that really signaled among international agencies, UN, UNICEF, bilaterals, that investing in young children really is the highest has highest rate of return, and in terms of the international development activities, and that investing in young children is World Bank's business. I think with that, from 1996 onwards, we have had a considerable increase of lending to early child development, and also I think with the support that we received from Mr. Wolfensohn in creating the knowledge bank. So a lot of discussion was done through efforts were done to disseminate the knowledge that we have gathered from neuroscience, from social science evaluations. At that time, the Preschool evaluation at 27 years has come out, and the brain research. And I had to note that our conference, the international the conference at Carter Center with President Carter, and preceded the White House conference in 1997 on the brain. So that kind of really started us to focus on young children. And I think the bank, with banks leveraging with a kind of counterpart, our Minister of Finance, and they are the one who controlled allocation to the resources between hard and soft sectors. And I think with the bank giving that, that commitment with why it is important to invest in early child development, that I think we started moving very much more and more in our regions. And so past 10, 15 years, we have increased our lending up to about 1.7 billion. I think it's still increasing. This is the account as of 2 years ago. So, but I really feel that, we need to appreciate one critical issue that in our work is this political support. And I believe that Elaine, you and Jim, Mr. Wolfensohn, really provide us that space within this institution, within the World Bank, to be able to promote investing in young children.
Can you talk a little bit more about working with governments? Mm-hmm. And governments who probably never heard of early child development.
Right. With governments, I think we come, our counterpart are the sectoral ministers, but also with kind of Minister of Finance overlooking on, where to allocate resources. So having that, we need to come through with some economic rationale. Why is the cost-effective investing in young children comparing with other sectors, comparing to investing in a cement factory and all that? So the economics work was very important. And then so other agencies which are, UNICEF, they are entitled to, they feel like they're working with children, but then they do not have that leverage with the ministers of finance to say, well, this is a worthwhile investment, not just only for the feel-good aspects, but really is an investment that has economic returns, but also it improves the human capital, very much linked to what we are seeing, the challenge in the 21st century. We're moving from this industrial blue-collar work towards the knowledge worker, and this whole transition with globalization, the competition for human capital, quality human capital. I think that has helped us in convincing government that they need to invest in their children, so that in 10, 15 years' time they are competitive. We have a quality, competitive workforce.
I mean, is it fair to say that when you arrived at the bank, when you started at the bank, there were almost no early child development programs except health programs?
Right, yeah. I think at that time we only had one in the India's Integrated Child Development Services. That's a very large-scale community-based program focusing on nutrition, and then there the quality was not as good. So there's after 25 years of investment in early child development services, we still could not get reduce the malnutrition. We still could not improve children's learning. So I think with all the social science evaluation research, which Barbara can really overseeing quite many of them, we're looking at the learning outcome. Yes, we try to get children into school, but are they learning? And what we've learned now from from neuroscience, and I have a few slides to show why it's important investing early, to show that learning really begins at birth, if not earlier, and that there are many other skills, the non-cognitive skills, which are so crucial now for us as knowledge workers, are set early on before the children even get to school.
Okay, so then Barbara, thank you, Mary. So when I arrived at the bank, you were really very focused on education in middle-income countries. In response to the Millennium Development Goals, you helped create the Fast Track Initiative. But I think what would be good for the students here to know about is how we moved from the focus on access, which we discussed this morning in the presentation, on getting children into school, to that focus on teaching and learning. And most of us, many of us, certainly realized years ago when we saw 4 out of 5 children dropping out of school before 5th grade, that why not? If you're not learning anything, why sit in a schoolroom? So we realized a long time ago, and we talked a long time ago, nonetheless, to have a strategy written that says learning for all instead of education for all, it's a huge breakthrough. And I'd like Barbara to talk about how did we get there?
Because I think this is a crucial issue, and we don't have a lot of time today, but if I can convince you of one thing, is that the field of education, and especially education economics, has been transformed over the last 15 years. And it's a totally exciting opportunity now to try to answer the fundamental questions. So, as I think you've all read, you've seen the new strategy, World Bank strategy document that Elaine mentioned. And the 3 pillars of the strategy: investing early, exactly as Mary said, investing smartly, and then investing for all. So I want to talk a little bit about the investing smartly. And the huge change that has happened over the last 15 years is the development of new sources of data that has enabled us to prove how fundamental learning is for all of the benefits of education. We've always believed this intuitively, but only really over the last decade with heroic work by Ludger Wussmann and Eric Hanushek of Stanford. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but I really encourage you to look at it. They've done this laborious effort to correlate all of the learning data for all countries of the world for the last 50 years on internationally standardized tests and find a way to equate them. And so what they found is that what always puzzled education economists is that, every kind of regression analysis we did trying to correlate years of schooling with economic growth or expenditure on schooling with economic growth, we couldn't get robust results. But with the new data set from Wussmann and Hanushek, we see that what does truly predict long-term economic growth is how much students learn, and not just on any test, but on a globally standardized scale. So really it's the work that OECD started doing, and honestly I feel like we in the World Bank missed an opportunity to be more active in this in the early 90s. But what OECD started doing with the PISA exam, which got all of the OECD countries testing students every 3 years on common areas, and now more and more developing countries have joined that. And this has been tremendous influence on education policymakers because they see, and especially the middle-income developing countries, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Chile that I work with, they want to know how they're doing compared to China, compared to Singapore, compared to Finland, compared to the UK, the US. And so this has really opened their eyes to this has given policymakers and finance ministers the proof they need to invest in education. Okay, but then how do you invest in education? The other big advance in our field over the last 10 years is the development of classroom-level data on how differently different teachers are able to advance the learning of their students. And this also has only become possible over the last 10 years or so with the expansion of classroom-level testing, starting in many places in the U.S., but now many developing countries are testing students regularly as well. And it's now we've discovered something, we have concrete proof of something that every parent and every kid has known always, that some teachers are better than others. But school systems and school principals, only the most adept school principals really have been able to do a good job over the years of identifying which are those teachers who are really producing learning gains for their students. And even more sophisticated question, which of those teachers are doing the best job of producing learning gains on a value-added basis, which means taking students that might be disadvantaged, might be poor, might be low income, might be girls in some countries, and being able to make their learning levels rise more than the teacher in the next classroom. So we have now concrete evidence that these teacher effectiveness varies tremendously. But the problem is that none of our formal data sets, none of our formal measures, teachers' years of schooling, teachers' seniority, teachers' formal education levels, this is data from Latin American countries on whether or not teachers with a master's degree systematically raise the learning results of their students. No correlation. So the issue now is to figure out what is it that's making some teachers much more effective in the classroom. So if I could just back up, I didn't want to take a lot of time, but this is really, the development of these new data has really transformed the way we're doing research in education. And now it's really focused everyone in all the countries I work with on teacher quality. That is the key driver of education quality. And the question is, how do we quote unquote build better teachers? And that's led us to realize that there's problems in most developing countries with how teachers are recruited, the incentives are low, the career trajectory is flat. I don't have a slide here, but we've analyzed PISA data recently, and it's fascinating. You look at the questionnaire for the kids who take the test, ask what do you want to do when what profession do you want to pursue eventually? And the test scores on PISA across all countries except one or two. Actually, Poland is the only one, and Uruguay is a close second. Almost all countries, the students who say they want to be teachers in the future score well below the mean score for their country on PISA. And students who say they want to become engineers in the future score well above the mean. So we have this structural problem in education. We're not getting the best and brightest into the field in many countries. And what's exciting is that policymakers are aware of that and are doing a lot of things, very innovative reforms to try to change that. I'm working with a number of countries in Latin America that are introducing partner programs for Teach for America. It's called Teach for All. It's the same idea, trying to attract a different breed of student into teaching, not maybe as a long-term career, but as a 2-year social service commitment. But the fact is, many of these students do stay on in teaching after that. And then in Brazil, they're trying to introduce bonus pay. In Chile has introduced new standards for teachers, new changes in the way teachers are evaluated. So there's this really growing consensus that this is the key issue. And then the third thing is what I'm passionate about at the moment, and then I'll shut up, is we're developing ways to measure what's going on in the classroom. Sources of data that we've never had before. And, basically what we know is that having the resources, having books in the room is not enough. This is a class in school in Brazil. The library was like this for 6 months. Nobody got it organized because the librarian had been transferred to another school. Having computers in the classroom is not enough. This is a school I visited in India. Sometimes even having a teacher in the classroom is not enough. This gentleman literally did not wake up when we walked in, and these poor students were sitting outside in the courtyard. So something has to happen at the school level to bring all those resources together to be used effectively. And that's the results chain for education. The inputs, the financing, the activities, the curriculum development, the teacher preparation, the building of the schools, the putting in place a student assessment system. All of those things really only have an impact if they affect teacher practice in the classroom. And that's how you produce the student learning results. But that output box has always been a black box for us. We haven't had any direct source of way of measuring what's going on there. So what I'm doing now in many countries in Brazil, I'm sorry, many states and cities in Brazil and also several other countries, is using this standardized measurement system to observe classrooms. And we're now in 10,000 classrooms in 6 different countries. And the results are really quite striking. And I don't need to go through all of them. But we're finding very clear relationships between what the teachers are actually doing in the classroom, how they're using materials, how they're engaging the students, how well they're keeping the class on task, and the learning results. It may not sound like rocket science by any means, but it's giving us the fundamental data we need to really go back to policymakers and say, you have a problem with this. 30% of the time your teachers are not even teaching. 12% of the time in some places your teachers are not even in the classroom because they arrive late and leave earlier. So then we can have a dialogue about what's driving that. Is it that the teachers have to teach in multiple schools because their salary level is too low to let them earn a living from one school alone? Is it that the school schedule is too tight, there's not enough time allowed for people and students and teachers to shift from one room to another? If I can leave you with one idea, is that we're kind of at the cusp of a kind of revolution in our understanding of education. And it's really exciting time to try to understand what makes teachers effective, how school systems can recruit the best and train them and support them in constantly improving their practice, and how those translates into learning results for students.
Yeah, that's great. So in terms of investing wisely, until we have the data to show what is a wise investment, it's very difficult to invest wisely. And a lot of this new data is phenomenal. So to be continued. Mary, part of the strategy is not only invest wisely, but invest early. And we do have an increasing amount, but never enough information to tell us why it's important to invest early. Could you go into that?
Okay. I think now from the neuroscience, we understand so much more that the early experiences really affect our brain development. In essence, when a child is born, their brain, their brain circuits are continuing to develop, depending on the early experiences. And not only that, those early experiences affect how the brain circuits are turned on and off, and how those synapses are actually connected. And that early experience, in a way, affects lifelong health, learning, and behavior. And that's the reason we talked about why we need to invest early, because early experience affects the brain development and set the trajectory throughout life. So I mentioned that all those experiences turn on and off the genes, and also affect the connection of those synapses that as being affected. So within the first few years, there's a tremendous growth and tremendous kind of rewiring and rewiring of a child's brain, and the experiences that we are talking about really is depending on this adult-child interaction. How the mother responds to a child's signals are in a way determining how those connections are. And those sensing pathways, the stimulation are the sound, smell, touch that the child is receiving from their environment, affecting the connection. So I just want to use example of language. Why, again, to make a case why it is important investing early. So we have a core concept. The very basic circuits are formed first, followed by language, followed by cognition. So using this, in the first within the first year, the sensory pathways such as vision and hearing, those are the the basic circuits that are formed. And based on that, language is developed. And as you see here, as early as within the first year, what the child has been exposed to in terms of vocal sound of the language, that is already being kind of, those connections are made, and those other sounds the child has not been exposed to in terms of language are starting to, they're starting to losing it. So within that first year, in terms of the connection of the brain circuits to language are already starting to kind of set up, having a very firm foundation. And it's only after that, the higher cognitive functions follow, the executive functions. So we see the importance, the critical importance of the early years, in particular with language. And another study that has shown that the disparities in language start very early, depending on the environment the child is exposed to, and also on the intensity of language the child is being exposed to. So you see here that within the first 16 months, every baby, every child, they have that same capacity, but with the exposure, with that early environment, their language vocabulary starts cutting, the gaps start widening. Those kids that are from higher educated family, higher income, they are exposed to more words, like very talkative families. Their language are far more developed in terms of their vocabulary than children from lower income, where the parents are less talkative and less interactive. And we see that, so by age 3, that wide gap is already there before the child even enters school. And then if you do a follow-up by age 9, that difference, that gap continues. And for all the teachers that you very much will understand, children's ability, children's vocabulary makes a big difference in how they perform in school. And we have similar study that shows that in developing countries, this is not just in the US, but in other countries, for example, this was done in Ecuador, showing that by income level, that we have a wide gap of development in language at the time the child enters school, and that gap doesn't really close as he continue. Another aspect I mentioned that first is on the learning, why we need to invest early, but another aspect on why we need to important to investing early because of the health effect. Here on the left side, you see a brain that the brain scan that shows the orange color is where the high brain activity, and the darker color is more of the lower brain activity. A normal brain with kind of normal nurturing environment is on the left side. You see a healthy brain with lots of activity or starting to develop with in the two-circle area where it's the temporal lobe. But then on the right side, you see that two-circle area is very dark, very low activity. This is the brain of a child which was raised in a Romanian orphanage, and then was placed in orphanage very, very early on, and the child basically went through very intense, low stimulation or extreme neglect. And with that, you can see that the temporal lobe, where it's kind of susceptible to receiving signal, receiving the sensing from the sensing pathway, touch, interaction, language, music, they are not receiving that. And with that kind of severe deprivation, you can see in those two circle areas, very dark, very low activity. And temporal lobe is where we receive all the signals from the sensing pathways, which affects emotion and later cognitive development. So we can see that those children, when they are much older, they have tremendous issues with emotional control, and also cognitive development. On health, we also know that from early adverse children who were exposed to early adverse conditions, abuse, family with domestic violence, extreme poverty, those children, this is done by in the U.S. a Kaiser Permanente study, showed that when they are adults, they have higher prevalence of chronic diseases, heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, alcohol abuse, and also depression. And here, one study that has been shown as a birth cohort study from New Zealand, this is a very powerful study that shows the power of gene and environment interaction. When we are born, we receive one gene, one allele from each of our parents. And this one, in this study, the 5-HTT, which is the serotonin transporter gene, we receive. And a short allele is one that is predisposed to a depression. So an adult that has two short alleles, when they were in the early years, they were abused with extreme neglect. Their prevalence of depression are much higher, whereas an adult who has had too long allele, they're protected. They in the same kind of abusive environment, they are protected, they're resilient. And whereas an individual with too short alleles that was raised in a nurturing environment early on, you see that their incidence of depression are just as one that did not have those that had too long allele. So here shows the power of how environment affects our expression of mental depression. Here we always use from the bank economic study to convince ministers of finance why it is cost effective. This study was done in Brazil and showed that 1 year preschool really increased education by 0.4 years, and then in terms of life income increased by 7%. And we also show that children from families from parents who are illiterate, their the benefit are even higher. This is the same kind of findings that we see in the U.S. why of targeting the high-risk population with adverse family situations. So that's this is the most recent study that shows the impact of preschool, how participation in preschool affects, in a way, have lasting effects into later education attainment. This was a Lancet study that used about 73 countries. The data show that gap of education attainment between the low income and high income are much smaller for kids who have participated in preschool. So that's kind of the evidence that we have now to help us to say, well, why it is important to invest early.
Thank you. So, for those of you working on the school in Ethiopia, you quite correctly identified the need for early child development. And I think Mary would say the earlier the better, the reaching out to the families, the 0 to 3 even more important than the 3 to 6. And of course with that goes high quality nutrition, nourishing nutrition. Barbara, you've talked actually a lot about investing wisely, but in your experience, how do you work with governments to change, as the report discusses, to change systemically what they do in education, to show what does it mean to invest wisely, and how do you create a system? And you've watched countries in Brazil make real changes, in Latin America, perhaps more than many parts of the world, enormous advances. Has that been through governmental systemic change or in other ways? And what influence can we really have? I don't know how you felt reading the strategy report, but when you talk of a systemic approach, it's complicated, it's difficult. I don't know if you can help these students understand how this is going to work and if you think it will work.
I think it will, because the countries that have made the most progress, and I would count Brazil as a case that over the last 15 years has really achieved a significant improvement in its education outcomes. Secondary enrollment rates have gone from something like 60% to 100%. Primary completion rates have gone way up. And the learning outcomes, above all, the learning outcomes have improved from Brazil scored very near the bottom of the pack in the PISA 2000. And I remember at the time, the then education minister, Paulo Renato Souza, told me, I had to fight to persuade President Fernando Henrique Cardoso to let us in PISA because I had to be frank with him. I said, we're going to go in, if we join this test, which is the test that the OECD countries give to their students, we will look terrible. But that will be the evidence I need to put in place the policies that can bring us change. And he did, and Brazil did look terrible, but they did give them the platform for reforms. And what they did is, I think, as Elaine says, it requires systemic change, and systemic change is multifaceted and complicated. But the other thing about systemic change is it's not a one-fit-all prescription. You have to diagnose your particular system and zero in on the issues that are the binding constraints to your advancement, and then design reforms, and usually multiple reforms, but reforms that make sense in your system. In Brazil, Paulo Renato did this. He diagnosed a couple of issues. Number one, there was no data on learning outcomes. They didn't even know how badly they were doing. So in the mid-90s, actually with World Bank support, we helped them to put in place the first national test. And then when Paulo Renato, as I said, said we need more than that, they linked to PISA and they equated their test with PISA. So now every year they get their own data about how they're doing that they can scale up to PISA and compare it to how that would compare with the other OECD countries. Second thing, he said, our education system is very unequal. We have schools in the southern rich part of the country that, where our budget spending is $1,000 per student, and schools in the Northeast where the spending is $30 per student per year. And the results are terrible. We can't live with that kind of inequity. So they designed what we call a funding follows the student reform, where the federal government intervened to equalize the funding across the whole country so that every school child across Brazil got the same budget for education. That was revolutionary, and it led to big increases in the average salaries for teachers in the poorest regions of the country, and started this dynamic of giving the poorer regions the resources they needed to start improving the system. And the third thing he did is he said we have to keep girls and poor kids from dropping out of school. And how would he do that? He gave a conditional what we call a conditional cash transfer called Bolsa Familia. Originally it was called Bolsa Escola. You've heard of it, right?
We discussed it this morning a little bit.
And, he said, I'm going to target that to families, and I'm going to give it to the mother. And that also had a very interesting sociological impact, because you had mothers for the first time in their lives getting an ATM card and getting some independent access to cash, and it really empowered many women. So he sent this signal that, just as our strategy said, education is going to be for all. We're going to make a real effort to make sure that the poorest and most disadvantaged kids in all parts of the country have an equal chance to stay in school and understand that how important it is to our country that they stay in school. We're going to invest equitably. We're going to equalize the funding formula, and we're going to track our results. We're going to measure how we're doing year by year on student learning. And so, even that formula has some elements that I think are universally relevant for other countries. But what I think is important is that he got a team together to think through what Brazil needed. And they came up with this plan, and they implemented the plan. And one thing that is also, I think, an important factor in Brazil's progress is that President Cardoso maintained the same education minister for the full 8 years of his administration. So there was this policy continuity, but was
tell what the average education minister is in it. I think it's 9 months.
Less than a year, yes.
It's under a year is how long the average education minister. So just so you know what you're dealing with.
But what fascinated many of us was that when there was a complete change of government in Brazil in 2004 and Lula came in, he maintained the same policies. He renamed some of them, but in some cases improved and extended them. So I think the key message is that 8 years of policy continuity led to some concrete results that no one could repudiate at that point. It would be very hard to turn back the clock. And in fact, so Brazil's stayed very much on the same trajectory and is making continued progress. You know, it's far from perfect. Yeah, you know, my research now is showing that we go into schools and we see many teachers writing on the blackboard for the entire hour with their back to the students, or, you know, 60% of the students not engaged, looking out the window, texting, chatting, etc. You know, the school system is far from perfect, but there's a commitment across the country to trying to improve things. And what they did with their national testing system is make the results very highly transparent. So actually, any parent can go online and compare the results for their school to the results for the neighboring school, to the results for the whole municipality, to the results for the next school district, to the results for their state. And it's made everyone, every policymaker in Brazil, every education secretary, look over his or her shoulder to see how's the next guy doing. And I was in Rio last year when the governor was reelected, and the very first question was, Secretary, the national results from the Prova Brazil came out yesterday, and state of Rio is second in the country, ahead of only Piauí, which is one of the poorest states in the country. What are you going to do about it? The next day, he fired the secretary, put in a much more competent secretary, and the policies have turned around since then. So there is scope for feedback about school performance out in the public domain to put political pressure on stakeholders to improve. Those are some of the things we've seen in Brazil. Chile has its own dynamic of another set of very ambitious policies. Peru now actually is, with the new government, launching some interesting reforms. Mexico keeps working, Colombia. So every place I go, it's really a very encouraging environment that policymakers get it. Finance ministers get it. Education ministers get it. We need to improve education. We want to be globally competitive, and we need to focus on results and how we invest smartly to produce results.
And do you think some of this has moved from country to country? Because it wasn't the situation in Latin America 20 years ago. How much of it was that effect of you see your neighbor doing well?
I think that competitive effect is tremendous impetus. I see it within Brazil, state to state, municipality to municipality, and I see it across Latin America. The Brazilians wanted us to take them to Chile to see the ECD programs in Chile, Crece Contigo. The Mexicans are interested in what the Brazilians are doing. I mean, and I think, honestly, PISA has had a lot to do with that, because it's this very transparent metric that shows everybody in the world exactly where they rank. It may not be a perfect test, but it has definitely been a wake-up call to countries across the world. And what's interesting is that more and more developing countries, instead of being afraid to benchmark themselves against the same big league, are joining in. There's just another new round of countries that have joined into PISA, so there's now something like 90 countries involved.
So, I mean, you should, in America, when Americans did, and they do the TIMSS and PISA, American mathematicians always said, oh, our top mathematicians are the best, so it doesn't matter how we do compared to everyone else. But when on the TIMSS, it showed that our top mathematicians did the worst of those who took the advanced exam, it transformed the country. The whole world of math teaching was so stunned and so surprised, and they're still working on curriculum change, teacher training change, stipends for teachers, not for students. But how do we get the top math and science students to stay in teaching or to go into teaching? So international, we hear a lot of bad things about No Child Left Behind testing, a lot of which I agree with. But well-designed international testing can make a huge difference. Mary, going back to investing wisely and working with governments by showing them the importance of investing early, what have been some of the challenges you had in convincing governments? Because certainly when we were at the bank, a lot of what I heard is, we can only afford basic education. What everyone was talking about was basic education. We don't have the money for early child development. How do you convince governments that they can't afford not to have early child development?
I think that still continue to be a big obstacle, and well, we use the cost-benefit analysis to compare that, why investing in early child development has a lot of benefits, not just for education. Children
Right.
who participate have a longer stay in school longer, has a lower dropout rate. Girls. Lower teenage pregnancy. This was a study that was done in Brazil, showing that participation in preschool improved
Right.
teenage girls. I think the issue that we're facing is we in our regions that we need to continually trying to communicate and create this political constituents that will support, that understand and will support investing early. We need to have secure financing. The case of Colombia, they have this the 3% payroll tax, so that protected the non-formal home-based program through fiscal crisis and during or change of administration. That is a very important factor. Financing support. Another one is creating demanding consumers. We need to create effective demand for early child development. I think now with the increasing female labor force participation, there is more and more of that request to the politicians. I remember in Rio, in Brazil, that's what was, there's a demand for it, in a way, all supersedes exceeds the supply of services. Therefore, they have to go into ways such as lottery system, trying to say, well, who do we allocate service to? And lastly, I think we need to create more new providers. For example, again, in Colombia, they have provided this non-formal, this home-based home care mother who has little education, so maybe up to the secondary school, but she has become a healthcare provider, child care provider. She has received training and she has a support system to supervise her work and to be able to deliver services. I think we need to continually expand that kind of care, that workforce to be able to interact so that we do not depend only on a limited availability of care providers. But then the demand is then improving their quality. How do you then help them within a very short time, help them understand that that kind of maternal, that kind of care provider adult-child interaction is so important in the early years, and to provide them that with that kind of training so that they will be able to provide the service needed.
That's great. Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, and I want to leave some time for questions. Just ask another couple of questions. In the presentations that have been done by the students, and this is really for both of you, they've talked a lot about multi-sectoral work. So I think if you could address how in early child development and education, how you have worked across sectors and how it's helped and enriched the work you're able to do.
It's the number one issue in ECD, no?
Yes, because ECD is not a sector. We're talking about service converging on the child, right. And still ministers, the countries, or even within the bank, we have the health sector, we have the education with the social protection, and all providing service. So there is this kind of competition, or there's turf. Our own. We're working our own silos. So I think it is important, I think, for us to overcome that, is to understand that, first we need to understand this kind of zero-sum mindset. It's not that we first, address child survival and then child development. It's not that we first address basic and then move up to secondary or tertiary before we move down to the early years. I think that kind of, that is tremendously important for us to continue raising awareness on the importance of the early years and how it has effect into health, into learning, into behavior, and the the cost of not doing that to the societies. For example, the cost of crime, incarceration, the cost of behavioral. I showed on depression is such a high prevalence. And so that I think we need to continually trying to make our messages understood, disseminate that, and to make that kind of changing mindset. So we move away from this kind of hierarchical model. I think right now, developing countries and the development community still has that kind of mindset. Let's focus on first this and then that, instead of this kind of the way Heckman always says, skill begets skills. The basic foundations in a way set, the facilitates what you will do later, whether it's from health or from learning cognitive development.
I mean, I think that, that's where it's crucial. And just to come back to what Mary was saying earlier, I mean, I feel that in the countries I'm working with in Latin America, the war has been won in terms of persuading ministers of finance and ministers of education and health that they need to invest early. But there's a lot of questions about how do I do it cost effectively in my environment. And just in the case of Brazil, as Mary knows, I mean, we're working with the state of Acre, where the most cost-effective way to deliver services to children turns out to be training people, health and education workers, to take canoes out to the remote villages where they can meet once a week with a group of children that cluster there, because it just would be impossible to get those young children to a facility when they have to travel by canoe. So, and in Rio Grande do Sul, Mary was instrumental in setting up a home visit system there, which is also in very dispersed rural areas, where you have to find a way cost effectively to get someone to go out and visit and leave a package of materials and give some weekly training to the mother or the caretaker at the home, rather than try to organize the costs of bringing the kids to a central point. So there's a lot of need for creativity, but I think there's also a need for more impact evaluation of the costs and benefits of these different approaches, so that we can build up our knowledge base on how to do it best.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question and then let you start thinking of questions you want to ask. So during the last years, and this is something I especially want those who are creating a school to think of, many more NGOs, large and small, have become engaged in education at all levels in the developing world. And I think it would help everyone here, how do local ministries coordinate the different donors? And with very weak management systems in a lot of the developing world, what is it doing to education ministers, finance ministers, to have to meet and greet all the donors, to have to coordinate? Are they coordinating the donors? And in view of the new system approach, has any thought been given as to what responsibility the World Bank or other institutions have toward coordinating the donor community from the World Bank, UNESCO, Gates, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, can all of this money and help keep pouring in an uncoordinated way? And finally, and it's all part of this question, what are the greatest challenges you see to achieving the new strategy, to achieving learning for all? And if you were a student at Wellesley today, what would you do to prepare for this new world they're going into? That's it. The answers are up to you. All I do is question.
All I can say is, since I'm no longer not a student at Wellesley, my brain is not capable of retaining that many questions.
Do you want me to?
But on the first one, let me just say quickly that it is a huge issue, that NGOs and charter schools and private entrepreneurs bring huge energy and ideas into education. And I think every ministry I deal with welcomes that. But it is very hard to keep things integrated. And sometimes it's very hard to draw the line of who's really accountable for the results being produced in those independent schools. And so I think it's an issue that our countries struggle with. And frankly, it's much more acute in low-income Africa than elsewhere, where there's so much donor funding. And each donor, for very legitimate reasons, needs to keep accountability for their own resources and what they produce. And they need to be able to market, we built so many schools, we hired this many teachers, Danish aid did it, or Netherlands aid did it, or whatever. And it's very rational from the standpoint of the countries trying to mobilize continued support in their countries for foreign aid, but it's very difficult for the recipient countries to manage and integrate all of these diverse efforts. I think, frankly, it's a lot even worse in health, where so many things have an individual disease focus that really undercuts the need for a health system to deliver services that include treatment for all of those diseases. But even in education, it is difficult. And Elaine mentioned earlier the Education for All Fast Track initiative, now called the Global Partnership for Education. That was one of the hallmarks of that effort, to try to bring all of the donors together around the table and say, we're all going to try to, my dream at the outset was that we'll pull out all our money into one basket and that would all go to support the country, but we would keep track of the results, and then all of the donors would be able to, claim credit for the full results. That hasn't come to fruition, but what it did happen is that we managed to create a framework where there was a local donor group constructed of everyone who was giving aid to that country, and they did meet regularly, and they all had to sign on to the same education sector plan, and they all had to agree, this is very important, to align their country's foreign aid investments in education with that plan. Because I was really horrified when I started doing the research for the book on this, to see that there was a lot of aid for education, being called aid for education, that was going to things that, one case, some very expensive multicolored Xerox machines being claimed as aid for schools in Yemen, when there were really, the schools in Yemen did not need that. The schools in Yemen needed basic books. The schools in Yemen needed some support for girls to be able to get them into classrooms. And so, the numbers will never add up if donors are saying they're supporting your plan, but not channeling resources that can be used for your plan. So that is a big issue, and it's a little bit even more complicated with small scale efforts, that one school here or one effort there, or a stipend program there. But again, it's this balancing act, because that energy, that ideas, and that immediacy that the donor groups or the NGOs bring to education are tremendous assets. But it does pose a challenge for the education system to try to raise the results of the education system.
Great answer. Anything to add?
Oh, you asked what
Well, if you were at Wellesley today and wanted to work in the developing world, what would you, now your background is medicine. You started life as a medical doctor, whereas you did economics. So even as all of you have come, and I did education, so even as all of you have come from very different majors, many roads lead into development work. For me, human development is really the foundation of all development. If you can get human development right, if this strategy works, then you get learning for all. If we really do, through all these different means, find ways of transforming what goes on in school and teach children to learn and to think and to communicate and to analyze and to have the skills to learn to teach them how to learn for the rest of you change the world, okay? It's not going to happen in your lifetime. It's certainly not going to happen in my lifetime. But I think what we've heard here is real change that's taken place in 20 years. And if one can accelerate that change over the next 20 or so years with whatever you're going to do post-college, it does make a difference. And, you know, the world can't live on education, but if you get education, if you get learning, human development right, early child development right, you have a healthier population, a happier population, a more skilled population, and you really do begin to see changes. And changes that will impact everyone, the rich countries and the poor countries. The questions are up to you. I don't think we have too much time left, so yes.
My name is Wendy West. I'm a Women's and Gender Studies major, biology minor. I'm originally from Kingston, Jamaica, but I've lived in Western Massachusetts for most of my life. And Mrs. Bruns, I know that your work focuses on education in Latin America as well as the Caribbean, and I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing education in the Caribbean, some of the initiatives that have been put in place, and whether they've been successful. Thank you.
That's a complicated, that's too long a question.
Do you mind, Wendy, if we take a few questions and maybe then you and I talk about Jamaica and some of the Caribbean countries? Because I actually don't, I've been in this job relatively recently. I don't know all of the Caribbean countries.
Hi, my name is Tenzin. I'm a junior. I major in Peace and Justice Studies, and I'm a Tibetan, but I live in India. My question is about the purpose and relevance of education, and is there enough discussion or emphasis on that? Because I think if you think that maybe not for everyone the purpose of education is to get a job, suppose in a country where majority of the people are farmers, then maybe for them some kind of agricultural education is more relevant and useful, because not everyone can go into the city. What will happen to the farms? So that kind of discussion, can you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Melda. I'm an Economics and Peace and Justice major at Wellesley. My question relates to a comment, Ms. Wolfensohn, you mentioned in an earlier presentation about in post-conflict societies the difficulty in teaching common history when sometimes histories aren't exactly agreed upon. And you mentioned Rwanda as a really good example of how, because they were able to teach common history, that really helped a lot with the development later. So has that been seen in other countries, and how does that come about?
Hi, my name is Marisa. My question, I'm a political science major, I'm sorry. My question
From
Ms.
Cuba.
Burns. Excuse me?
From Cuba?
Yes, from Cuba.
It's important to know.
Yeah. My question goes to Ms. Burns. You mentioned that the quality of teachers is very important. However, programs like Teach for America, Teach for China, and Teach for All have been often criticized because they place teachers for only a 2-year period. I was wondering about your input on this. What do you think about the program, and what do you think the effects of placing a temporary teacher is in a student's life?
Hi, my name is Mariah Smith. I am a Peace and Justice Studies major here with a focus on education. So this has been particularly interesting for me to learn more about this topic. So just throughout my time studying education at Wellesley and working in education, I've learned a lot about the importance of positive student-teacher relationships and transforming the quality of schools. And that's been something that I felt very strongly about in creating a quality school. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that and, how the role of a teacher is really important in understanding not only, what they're teaching to their students, but their students themselves, the culture of the classroom, and fostering that in the classroom, and understanding and caring about their students. So just the importance of positive student-teacher relationships.
I think maybe one more question.
Hi, my name is Davina. I'm a junior majoring in history, and I'm from Singapore. So my question is regarding the test that Mrs. Burns was talking about just now, because a lot of times we hear criticisms of standardized tests, and even in my own country we have criticisms of national exams, because it just doesn't help people to develop critical thinking skills, but just promotes learning and like a very regurgitation of knowledge. So as we are moving from not just learning facts, but to critical thinking and creativity, what reforms do you think we should make in how we assess learning outcomes?
We're trying to learn from you.
Yeah, exactly.
Come on. Don't look. We're all looking at, wow, look at Singapore on the Thames. How do we get there? So, okay, who wants to begin? It's a lot of it's a lot of questions with. I mean, if I can just in the Caribbean, and I'm not up to date, but basically, at one time you could leave secondary school and start teaching high school. So a lot of the changes, and I don't know what's happened from the time I've left the bank 5 years ago, was trying to just get teacher education, to require some sort of teacher education to improve the quality of teaching. I mean, this was not a complicated science. And some teacher, you could actually spend your whole career teaching high school without ever going to education school, or you could teach for a few years and then decide to get a degree in teaching. So if you start there, the Caribbean has a long way to go.
I would just update, though, that we've been working over the past year with the Jamaican Ministry of Education, and they've become very excited about this classroom observation research, and in fact, they have decided to mainstream that into their school, what they call their school supervision system, but we're trying to encourage them to think of it more as a school support system. Because the whole point of this classroom observation is to be able to give you an understanding of where the weaknesses of your systems are and where the weaknesses within your schools and classrooms are, to go back and develop training programs that encourage teachers to use more diversified teaching strategies or make better use of available materials, teach, sort of get people on board about the importance of using time effectively, which in many countries, teachers, they may go to formal teacher training colleges, but those colleges do not talk about concrete issues, like how do you manage a classroom? How do you keep a classroom engaged where you have some learners at this level and others at that level? So I think I'm excited by what's going on in Jamaica now. I think it's very encouraging.
Barbara, I'm a little concerned that you and Mary have a plane to catch, and I'd forgotten that.
But if you'll permit me just to quickly try to have a few reactions to the questions.
Go ahead.
Critical thinking. Everyone is, in Latin America at least, is talking about the importance of critical thinking. I mean, they get it. They want kids not just to learn by rote. And in fact, I think PISA did a good job of developing a test that tests ability to analyze problems and not regurgitate knowledge, and that's why it's so interesting to policymakers across so many different countries. But most national assessments are not as sophisticated, and a lot are really very more traditional. But we're trying to work with those countries to make sure that the assessment system underpins the country's goals for producing a new kind of student. The Teach for All, it is an only 2-year program, and frankly, I'm as a researcher, I'm interested in knowing how does it work, and to what extent does it work. And there's been a number of studies in the U.S. The most rigorous one was done in Texas schools, Houston schools, about 10 years ago, and found that the Teach for All teachers, even brand new Teach for All teachers, compared to even teachers who had been teaching in the system prior to that, achieved more improvement in their students' learning in math than the regular teachers. But in language, it was a wash. So I think there really isn't a solid enough evidence base to know do they bring enough content knowledge to the table to overcome their lack of experience, to make it worthwhile for the schools to use these people. But one thing that is very different, and something I'm interested in exploring too, is that the ethos of what's driving these people into education is sometimes quite different, or at least different from what some of the teachers unfortunately become after 10 or 15 years on the job and frustrated and kind of burnt out. And I was in a school in Chile 2 months ago watching the Enseña Chile, the Teach for All teachers there, and the director of the school said, I can't get enough of them. I'm weeding out my worst performing traditional teachers, and I'm trying to hire all of the new Teach for All teachers and Sene Chile teachers I can. Why? Because they inspire the kids. They believe in the kids. They communicate to the kids that they really care. And I saw one classroom where the Teach for All teacher had each child put in a corner of the desk their aspiration in life, you know, to be an actress, to be a policewoman, to be a mechanic, an engineer. And just I could see the way they were engaging with the students was different from the next classroom I went into, where the teacher basically harangued the kids about how badly they did on the test, done on the test. And, you know, it backfired completely because the kids got so, you know, they started just ignoring the teacher. Instead of being embarrassed, they started talking among themselves about, you know, how cool it was to do badly. And you know, when she read off each student who got a worse grade, they started cheering. So, you know, it was completely counterproductive.
As you walk out of the room to catch your plane, I think we're all going to thank you with an enormous hand. Thank you so much. Love.
You make a fast exit if you're Bruns. Listen, our education director asked me to distribute these, and I'd be happy to leave this. And yes.
So stay a minute.
And this is about the fast track initiative.
Yeah, I want you to catch your planes. Thank you so much for coming out. Barbara, I'll be in Washington next weekend, the 28th, this coming weekend.
I'm leaving next weekend.
I'll call, we'll talk. Okay, I want to thank you for being a wonderfully attentive audience. And to just say, because you did ask about Teach for America, to tell you about Math for America, which is for math students, and to tell all you that in Math for America, we would like top math students to teach math. We will pay for their masters in math, and you will get a stipend for the first 5 years of teaching. It's in New York and 4 other sites, Chicago, LA. So they're alternatives to Teach for America, and Math for America is about to become Math and Science for America. And I want all Wellesley students to be aware of it because it's a big deal. And as part of it, we are creating a new math teaching program in New York City, actually at CCNY, which is going to be innovative and creative and address all the problems in the past programs for how to train teachers in math for high school. You've been a wonderful audience. I don't know if there are any other questions, but I think you've been great, and I will see you all at tea to answer any other questions.